you to unceded traditional territory of the Algonquin people. If it was June or July, I would maybe, if you were nice to me, I would show you where some of the berries are. But right now, I would just ask you not to skidoo on our lakes because it's not safe yet. It looks like it might be safe, but it's not safe yet. And I did see Madeleine Redford last night at an event, and I said, I know it's an early start. I can't pick berries for you, but I did go and pick some chocolate-covered coffee beans, which I brought here in case anyone needs them. So thank you for coming so early and joining us. I have the honor of introducing Madeleine Redford, who will be our chair for the day. Madeleine was born in Iqaluit. She is in her second term as mayor in Iqaluit. She has a commitment to her community. She strives to be accessible, responsive, and to all her people. She's actually a personal heroine of mine. We've worked together on various files, and she has 30 years experience. So she started when she was 5. 30 years experience in business and governance and economic development. She's a graduate of the Kotierk law program from the University of Victoria. And after graduating, she worked at the Supreme Court of Canada with Justice Charon. She's a member of the National Indigenous Economic Development Consortium, Eco-Justice, and other boards. She is presently actually spearheading the setup of an Internet Exchange Point, an IXP, in Iqaluit in partnership with Sierra and Microsoft. She's a busy person. Madeleine, her expertise is grounded in partnership building, developing local capacity towards self-government, governance, good governance. She has a track record working in industry with governments, with Indigenous governments, and is working to assess and identify better outcomes for all. So please welcome me in welcoming, join me in welcoming Madeleine Redford.
Thank you. Good morning. I was telling people last night, I didn't think I was much of a morning person, at least not usually with people. So welcome. Also, I like to thank the organizers for being invited. And when I agreed to do initially just opening remarks, because I absolutely love the concept of what we're going to be discussing today, no one told me how early it was actually starting. So next time, when I'm asked to do welcoming remarks, I'm going to say, when does it start? Because I think only the military has ever managed to get me up this early, and it was to actually, get on one of their frigates on our bay. But that was in part because of the tide and the fact that the military usually starts at 6 a.m. So, on that basis, welcome for everyone who decided that this was important enough to get up for this early, because it is actually an important and fascinating conversation that we're going to have about our Inuit and Canada, but most importantly, not just reconciliation, but economic reconciliation, because at the end of the day, we need to all be benefiting from this great country and not seeing such a big disparity that we often feel in our north. So, but I'm not going to do much more than just say Udlakut Tunngavik, and I have the immense honor of introducing Sally Webster. I've known Sally for many years. Sally's originally from Baker Lake. She's lived in Ottawa for some time. She not only is a mother and a grandmother, at this point you may even be a great-grandmother. She's like raising her eyebrows. So, and I can tell you that not only is she just such a kind and lovely woman, she actually makes you feel like as if when you're part of the Inuit community that you're part of Sally's family, because she has such a big heart. So Sally's going to, she has a good look? No? You don't have.
I wasn't told to.
Okay. But nonetheless, I'm going to, Sally, would you like to nonetheless guide us in our morning with our morning words and our morning prayer? Okay.
Tamani, with me. You stay here with me. Please stand. Oblakut, Tunngavik, Ottawa. Welcome to Ottawa. And Ottawa, I'm sitting with the leaders and speakers. I'm not one of the leaders or speaker here, but I'm here to open the meeting for you. And I'm so happy to be here. I'm a morning person, not evening person. I'm going to say a prayer in my own language is to give you knowledge and wisdom during the meeting. Gutiatata, koyagayagay naktapagit, ubla, tamani tiluta, akun napting nitudit, ukwa sivulaptit, atane, sila tunang migtuni sivigik, kiw yung nasiyakop lugit, apeksarong nakot lugilo, inokotimingnit. Tamakwa tamaita kaoyimayatit, ayuakang nitutit, uwapting nitutit, akun napting nitutit. Koyagiyagit, naktapagit, tuksak pong ating ni Jesus. Amen.
Okay. So just for the folks, I've just been reminded that this is actually going to be videoed for rebroadcast, and that our first session, I'm going to be inviting up Clint Davis. He's going to moderate the discussion with the board of ITK, Inuit, Tapiriit, Kanatami, what economic reconciliation and inclusive growth can mean for Inuit Nunangat. So Clint, if you want to come up. I didn't actually have any bio for you, Clint. I know Clint for a while. I mean, he's dynamic. Well, you seem a lot more chipper than me, so I figure that the dynamic, works at 7 a.m. And I think you're going to do an amazing job facilitating what is going to be a fascinating session between Aluki, Johannes, and Natan, because I'm really looking forward to this panel. So, Clint.
Nakumik. Thank you, Madeleine. Everyone check out her hair. Did you see the thing? It's nice, right? It's pretty reflective of who Madeleine is, I think. So it is a real honor to start off this session, particularly looking at economic reconciliation and what inclusive growth means for Inuit. It's also an honor to have Inuit leadership here today with ITK. We've started early to ensure that we actually heard their voices and got their perspective on something which is a pretty critical topic, I think, for this country. They actually have, and I'm sure Aluki, Natan, and Johannes will talk a bit about it, but I think they have a very busy day, starting with the board meeting and then meetings with Crown Inuit relationship and so on. So it is a real honor to have you here today to share with us your thoughts. The way we're going to do this is each speaker will have the opportunity to speak for about 10 to 12 minutes to give their thoughts on what is economic reconciliation from the perspective of Inuit and within Inuit Nunangat. And so I was thinking what we could do is I'll introduce the speakers and each one will come up. We'll take a seat and we'll start the conversation. Rather than being up at a podium, I think it makes a lot more sense to just have us seated and have it much more of a bit of a collaborative discussion. So our first, I want to introduce, will be our first speaker is going to be Aluki Kotierk. Aluki was first sworn in as the 8th president of Nunavik, Tunngavik Incorporated on December the 13th, 2000. What did I say? Did I say Nunavik? How embarrassing. I'm so sorry. Nunavut. You know, it was really funny. So I'm really chipper and obviously on the ball at this hour of the morning. So it's funny because we were introducing ourselves yesterday. We had the launch of the Inuit Development Corporation Association, and Sheldon Nimchuk, who's worked for like 1,000 years for QC, introduced himself as working with Kotierk Corporation. We were like, what are you talking? Anyway, so here I am. Nunavik, Tunngavik, what Nunavut, Tunngavik Incorporated on December 13th, 2016. During her campaign, she actually focused on empowerment, Inuit language and culture, collective healing, and Inuit identity. Originally from Igloolik, Aluki lives in Iqaluit with her family. She grew up in a bicultural home as the oldest of 7 children. She has a bachelor's and master's degree from Trent University. Aluki, it is such a pleasure to have you here. So if you want to join me on the stage. Next, introducing Johannes Lampe. He's president of Nunatsiavut government, not Nunavik government. He previously, he served as the Minister of Culture, Recreation, and Tourism, and he's the 3rd person to lead Nunatsiavut government. So it's a real honor to have you here as well, Johannes. So please, if you can join us on stage. He's also my president, considering I'm from Nunatsiavut as well. And 3rd, Natan Obed, who's president of Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami. He's originally from Nain, Nunatsiavut, and now lives in Ottawa. For over 10 years, he's lived in Iqaluit, Nunavut, and worked as the Director of Social and Cultural Development and for Nunavut Tunngavik, or not Nunavik. And Natan has devoted his entire career to working for the benefit of Inuit. So Natan, if you could please join us as well. So thank you. Here are our speakers, ladies and gentlemen. So Aluki, we're going to start with you. There's been a lot of discussion around reconciliation, and some would probably say that it's a word that's used almost too much, right? And it's a definition, it's something which doesn't have a very clear definition. And so when you lay that with economic reconciliation and the work that you're doing in Nunavut, what does, from your perspective, what does economic reconciliation mean for you? And what would you think that inclusive growth means for the Inuit of Nunavut?
Thank you very much for having me here this morning and accommodating our schedule to start early. I guess for me, when I was thinking about this issue, before I get into economic development in the Nunavut context, I wanted to speak broadly about how Inuit have moved in a very short period of time from a land hunters and gatherers type society into communities, and how in living history, and I mean people like us are related to people who were born on the land and had their own economy, and now we're living in communities. And Inuit are participating in the economy by having businesses, and you can see the growth in economic development in terms of Inuit participation. And Inuit, despite having been living on the land, have changed the map of Canada in a peaceful way. And yeah, just yesterday, there was the announcements of the Inuit Economic Development Association. Mm-hmm. And when you think about it in that way, I think, wow, like, is how incredible it is, how incredible Inuit are to be able to transition in such a way. So I wanted to start off with that because I think it's really important to talk about Inuit participation in the Canadian economy, and how Inuit continue to rapidly take part in leaps and bounds in the Canadian economy. And in Nunavut, I represent Nunavut. So in Nunavut, the Nunavut gross domestic product is well over $1.8 billion, and it increased 13.3% in 2017. And the majority of where that growth comes from is from mining and quarrying, mineral exploration, construction, etc. And we know that Inuit continue to contribute to the Canadian economy. And we know that, for instance, in 2016, Indigenous-owned businesses contributed an estimated $12 billion to Canada's GDP, and that the total combined income of Indigenous households, businesses, and governments reached $32 billion. Like, that's incredible. And I think this is all very good, and I'd like to stand here or sit in front of you and say the sky is the limit for Inuit when it comes to economic development opportunity. But I can't really say that, because when you look at the socioeconomic statistics, when you look at the data across Inuit Nunangat, and although the GDP continues to grow, it's not enough for us to say, wow, the GDP is growing, because is it really going into the pockets of Inuit? And we're all here as ITK board members representing Inuit Nunangat and advocating to make life better for Inuit. And so is it enough that the GDP is growing? Is it enough that the Indigenous population, that Inuit, are contributing in this way to the Canadian economy? When we look at the social economic indicators of Nunavut Inuit and Inuit across Canada compared to other Canadians, it becomes quite obvious that there needs to be more opportunity for inclusiveness and equity in Canada's economic growth. And I know the theme is expanding the circle, and I think it's only if we achieve that we're going to be able to expand the circle. Simply looking at the social indicators, there is much work to be done on equity, inclusion, and reconciliation. In Nunavut, our social reality is that 7 out of 10 Inuit children are going to bed hungry. Our social reality is that the median income of Inuit is far less than the median income of non-Inuit. Our social reality is that Nunavut's unemployment rate is 13.4%, and you know that the vast majority of that is made up of Inuit. Our social reality is that Nunavut Inuit continue to struggle to receive a proper education that is both culturally relevant and meets the test for further post-secondary education. Our social reality is over half of Nunavut Inuit have not received post-secondary education. That is further exacerbated by not having the ability to have an Inuit university. In 2017, in June, NTI had commissioned a report by PricewaterhouseCoopers looking at the non-implementation of Article 23. And for those of you who are not aware of Article 23, it speaks to achieving our Inuit representative workforce within government, within Nunavut settlement area. So when I say government, it speaks to the federal government within the Nunavut settlement area. It speaks to the territorial public government as well as municipalities. So the obligation is that governments are to achieve a representative workforce. And what we found out of this study is that through the contract period of 2017 to 2023, by not fully implementing Article 23 and not achieving 85% Inuit employment, Inuit are losing over $1.2 billion. And this is just direct salary dollars. It doesn't even talk about, it doesn't even capture the amount of money that's being lost in indirect benefits. Recently, the Nunavut Inuit labor force analysis was very quietly released. And if you look at that, we know it demonstrates something that NTI has been communicating for many years. And more specifically, it states that the availability, interest, and preparedness of Inuit for government employment may have more to do with systemic barriers than previously believed. And so one of the challenges I would pose to government is, let's see if we can fully implement what we've already agreed to. In my view, economic development means self-determination, and it's about self-determination. Inuit are and want to be involved in initiatives that build the economy and make life better for Inuit. I always say Inuit culture is based on a very high work ethic. Inuit are hard workers and persistent, and they are individuals who want to work hard and persistently for the common good. So when Inuit struggle, often they go on social assistance. But before they do that, and many times, Inuit will first turn to their family. And when we speak about family in an Inuit sense, I hope you understand that it means it's a larger group of people than what many Canadians think of as family. And they go to their neighbors or to their community at large. So for instance, if Aluki, if someone's hungry, one of their first thoughts will be, oh, I know Aluki just caught a seal. I'll go visit her. She might give me some seal meat. And I think I wanted to talk a little bit about that because I know that the recent Aboriginal People Survey indicated that 84% of Inuit, 15 and older, are still participating in traditional crafts and harvesting. And I think we can do a much better job of quantifying what that means. Imagine if we were able to put a monetary value on the amount of food that, as Inuit, we share and use and eat and consume and use their pelts and stuff like that, right? And I think there's not been, that has not been quantified in a way in which we can talk about it as an economic investment in our communities. Inuit culture places a high emphasis on sharing. In fact, we've developed very complex ways of sharing. And if many of you know Inuit, you know we have a naming system. So a person might be named after their grandmother or their father or their brother. And based on how someone's named, that already creates a social obligation and way in which we share any kind of income or food. And I'm going to use food and meat as an example of that economy. And when a person catches their first catch, Inuit often are not allowed to eat that because the expectation is that you catch your first seal and then you're expected to share that. And based on naming and who's related to you, you share it in this proper way. And I think I wanted to share that to demonstrate that as Inuit, we have our own economic model of wealth and health and success. And I think it's so important that when we're thinking about that, when we're thinking about economic development broadly, we have to think about what is the purpose of economic development. And I started off talking about the GDP, but is that the measure of success? And I think we need to start questioning what is the measure of success in terms of how we can be more inclusive when we're talking about economic development and we're talking about Inuit communities. Expanding the circle and achieving inclusive development will require a multifaceted approach. It includes living up to and fully implementing the signed treaties and agreements that foster social change that Inuit envisioned. It includes advancing reconciliation to allow for Inuit to meaningfully participate in national and global economies. And as I stated, economic development, in my view, is self-determination. It is about having choices. So whether an Inuk decides they want to be an owner of a big company or a small business, or whether an Inuk wants to be a senior manager in the public service, or whether they want to be a geologist in the resource development field, or whether they want to be an expert hunter and provide for the community in that way, we need to expand the space and be more inclusive, and we need to provide the supports so that Inuit can actually be self-determining. And I know, and I would encourage everyone to think about how we can do that better. Kotierk.
Thank you. Thank you. That's a remarkable amount of information to think about, and particularly I think where you talked a lot about, first of all, coming off the land, and then even though the economy has evolved and there's been tremendous change, what role does that still play in terms of economic inclusion? So I think that's absolutely brilliant. Johannes, you represent the last Inuit comprehensive land claim to be settled. So needless to say, and you've seen remarkable change with a very successful government and a strong civil service. Being on the east coast of the country, what for you, and sometimes dealing with a tough provincial government at times too, right? So what does this mean for you, economic reconciliation for Inuit of Nunatsiavut?
Nakamik Clint, certainly an honor to be up here with Aluki and Natan and Inuhatika Nakamik Tamani Pivichati Tauna Muhalayamik. To your question, Clint, being the most eastern, people of Newfoundland, Labrador, certainly has challenges, and but to be given the opportunity by Inuit Tapiriit of Canada has given us, the position to become a collective of, Inuit across the Inuit homeland, and but the challenges and the issues that Labrador Inuit face are not new, and most certainly were the government of Newfoundland Labrador has ignored and dismissed the needs of the Labrador Inuit in terms of transportation, whether it's through marine service, air transportation, and to have access to services. It's certainly a challenge, and we at times have to approach the government of Newfoundland Labrador a number of times before we get a reply or a response to the issues that we are facing. And two such issues are the infrastructure issues, whether it's for marine service, and one, the biggest issue that we have right now is the Nain airstrip, where we have the oldest and the shortest airstrip in Newfoundland Labrador, and for Labrador Inuit to see economic reconciliation, we need to have upgraded infrastructure, and right now we don't have that, and we have been lobbying Canada and Newfoundland and Labrador government to help us and to support us in getting those things that we need, and the things that Labrador Inuit need. And food insecurity is certainly an issue, where the Georgia caribou herd, which was the largest herd in the world and not too long ago, and but the numbers have come down to 5,500, and it's not certain whether that herd will survive, and that is certainly a concern for Indigenous people, and including Labrador Inuit. Yes, and as Aluki said, we as Inuit, we share, we have for thousands of years, and most certainly pass on the skills that our fathers and our grandfathers have had, and being on a coastline of Labrador, certainly we have to be expert, and we have to have that traditional knowledge and the experience that's been there for thousands of years. And but we say no matter how hard it snows, or no matter how hard the wind blows, or no matter how hard the rain comes down, we're still there, and we'll continue, given the opportunity, to be a partner in economic development. We certainly are happy that we're given the opportunity to be in the collective.
Nakamir? So I think that's tremendous insight, Johannes, particularly highlighting one issue, and I know Aluki experiences it back in Nunavut, is just that investment in critical infrastructure, right? Like if you don't actually have those tools, it is hard to participate effectively within not only the local economy, but the broader economy as well. So I think that's highlighting a critical issue that maybe some people completely forget about. And I always like to say, and it was said by the guy to my left, Canada, the country isn't complete yet. It's time to really think about critical infrastructure for the North. So Natan, obviously your travels take you throughout Inuit Nunangat, but across the country in different parts of the world. And I know you've thought a lot about reconciliation specifically and the economy. How much of this, first of all, what is economic reconciliation to you, and how much of this is general awareness of the Canadian public about what is the North, and not romanticizing, as you said last night, what Inuit are supposed to be?
Thanks, Clint. Good luck, everyone. First, I wanted to recognize the political leadership in the room, especially members of my board, Johannes and Aluki. It's always good to share a stage with you. I also just noticed that President Charlie Watt from Macavie Corporation has joined us. And I saw earlier Andy Morehouse, who's a vice president with Macavie Corporation. Good morning. If I've missed any political leaders, I apologize. Also, thank you to everyone here for being a part of this session. It's great to be able to talk about economic development and business within Inuit Nunangat. As far as economic development and reconciliation, I think it's good for us to just reimagine Canada and reimagine the way Inuit have participated or fit within Canada from the very beginning of European contact. So reconciliation actually does have meaning. It isn't as if economic development existed in a blank space, that now we are just all willing to come from the same space in this time of reconciliation together and build Inuit-specific considerations into contracting or procurement or for business development interests. Starting with whaling in the 16 and 1700s, and that whaling economy that fed the growth of many parts of Europe and also in North America. I went to school in Boston, Massachusetts, and a lot of those big mansions in downtown Boston were built off the backs of Arctic whaling. Yeah. So this idea that economic development is only something that is here in the present for us to consider or in the recent past is not actually true. That economic development and business interests have been interacting with Inuit Nunangat for hundreds and hundreds of years. You think about the Hudson's Bay Company and the amount of natural resources that Inuit helped procure that then fed the development of this country. Yet you don't see massive infrastructure in Inuit Nunangat that was linked to Inuit who benefited from the fur trade for a good 100 or 150 years. We were part of that fur trade, and many Inuit provided some level of subsistence or some level of support for their families through that process, but it was not on equal footing to the Hudson's Bay Company and the interest that they had in procuring wealth from Inuit Nunangat. And then you think about World War II, and then the years following in the Cold War, and the largest infrastructure build ever in Inuit Nunangat, which was done primarily by the US military and the Canadian military as well. You think of the infrastructure in Goose Bay, in Iqaluit, in Kotierk, in Coral Harbor, in Inuvik. That wasn't built by the Canadian government. All of this was built by the US military in agreement with the Canadian government. But did Inuit win contracts to build those facilities? The airstrips, the runways, the distant early warning facilities. These are all part of the economic legacy of Inuit Nunangat. You think of fisheries, and the fisheries 0A, 0B, the waters adjacent to Nunatsiavut, and Tunngavik, and Nunavut. And historically, what interest Inuit played. Those times are changing, and Inuit have more access to quota now than ever before, but it is still not in the same way that Atlantic Canadians enjoy quota adjacent to Atlantic Canada jurisdictions. So that's all to say that there is a need for economic reconciliation, and there's also a need to understand that Inuit have not benefited, in some cases at all, historically, from economic development activities in Inuit Nunangat. Therefore, the policies, the legislation, the programs, and then the investment that is necessary in building economic reconciliation is, yes, a final piece in building this country, but also an act of reconciliation. In other social issues, such as healthcare or education, there have been apologies by the Government of Canada. There has been a concerted effort to reverse the racism and the exclusion and marginalization that systemically created the conditions that we see today within our socioeconomic status and our health status. It's almost as if that didn't happen within the economic development field. And we need to change that conversation. There's a reason why we talk again and again and again about implementation of land claims, about infrastructure, because Inuit Nunangat has never had the level of investment that is comparable to the level of investment within southern Canada to build the country. You think of airlines, and you think of the fact that we don't have roads, we don't have railroads that connect southern Canada with Inuit Nunangat. But airlines don't have an essential service designation, whereas the infrastructure that you might take for granted in southern Canada has that status of essential. The road between here and the rest of Ontario is essential. Mm-hmm. So are the railroads to move goods and services across this country. How do we get grain from the prairies to Atlantic Canada? How do we get oil going back and forth across this country? This doesn't just happen because businesses create and pay for every part of that infrastructure and part of that transportation process. There are embedded subsidies and considerations that allow your economy, the southern economy, to function well. We are working with a patchwork of inadequate subsidies or no subsidies at all, with outdated infrastructure that was largely built by the US military, yet we are still resilient, and we still have a huge amounts of success in relation to economic development and business development, starting from our small businesses in our 51 communities to then the businesses that are in concert with our representational organizations, our economic development organizations that are linked with our representational organizations. it's interesting that we have had tremendous amounts of success, but we also then, because we are Indigenous and because Canadians think differently about Indigenous business than they think about non-Indigenous business, I still get really interesting questions. Like in relation to working on revisions to the Nutrition North program, I have federal officials who say, well, isn't it a conflict of interest that Inuit, Tapiriit, Kanatami would want to talk about the revisions to the Nutrition North program when Inuit might benefit from the way in which the subsidy is implemented. This is from the same government that I believe purchased a pipeline about 3 or 4 months ago. So the idea that Inuit are not complex enough and our governance models are not complex enough to be able to represent our people, represent our social interests, and then also respectively have business interests and economic development interests is just a reflection of the inherent stereotyping and racism that still exists in this country. That we need to break down these walls and we need to better articulate the complexity of Inuit governance and the power that we have not only to change policies and legislation, but also to self-determine and to have a society, a fully functioning society with social interests, with educational interests, with business interests, with health interests. Allowing for Inuit to have that as a platform or foundation for then the conversation about reconciliation is, I think, the only way that we get to the place where we need to be, where the median income isn't $70,000 less than non-Inuit within Inuit Nunangat, and where our employment rates are lower and our educational attainment is the same as, and our health outcomes are the same as or better than Canadian, the Canadian averages.
So you probably noticed we have a new participant on the panel as well, Senator Charlie Watt. It's a real honor and pleasure to actually have you here today to participate as well. Charlie's the president of Makivik Corporation. He was elected president for the 3rd time in January 2018 during Makivik's 40th anniversary year. He was Makivik's founding president from 1978 to 1982, and then again in 1988 and 1984. So clearly, and a long time serving public servant as well. So Charlie, we're talking about economic reconciliation and what that means for Inuit. And considering that you have extensive experience in representing the political and economic interests of your people in Northern Quebec, can you share with us your thoughts on what is economic reconciliation to you as Inuit in Nunavik?
I'm not sure whether my voice is going to come out.
Uh-oh.
I'm not quite. I lost my voice this morning, so I might have difficulties addressing to the crowd here in the way that I would like, on account of the fact that I have very little voice coming out. I don't know what happened when I was driving from Montreal to here.
Oh no.
Last night, and I probably had a bug or something, I don't know. Anyway, the questions that you asked, and that's basically why I'm here. I'm wondering the same thing. What is reconciliation have to do with the economics or vice versa? And it's a quite interesting subject matter, knowing the fact what happened to Albion across the country, not only the Inuit, but also the First Nation at BT. Everything have practically been taken away from the Aboriginal groups in this country. And at times, makes you wonder, how does the rest of the Canadian feel about the fact that they have taken this practically everything that could be going for us in economic field. So I think one of the areas that we need to talk about is the governance issue. If we don't talk about the governance issue, that will enable us to get to the point where we want to. And that is not really happening today yet. And even though some of us are quite successful running the business and running the airline, for example. And that, as like our president said, this is the only way for us to deliver the goods, move our people, move across the north, and so on, because we have no roads.
Sorry to interrupt. Can we try this instead?
I don't, I'm not.
It's good to go. Just talk.
It
Is
was
that a
on.
little better now? No, I don't think it's my voice, is not the. So actually, I came here to listen and I learn what this is all about, because I would not really plan to come when I saw the opportunity. The fact that a statement that was made in regards to reconciliation, how are we going to deal with the question of reconciliation when we are talking about the economics? I think we have a long way to go in that field. It's not a straightforward thing because it's, as our president said, the government also have a lot to do with it. At times the government set the tone and we have to follow that tone. And at times that the opening, the gaps that we can enter into and providing a meaningful input, that is not really there, especially in the field of question of title issue. Where is that in the minds of the government today, the question of title? The land. So this is a quite interesting subject matters because I don't know how the country is going to deal with that when they're dealing with the question of reconciliation. I think that we should start there. How do we deal with the question of land? When the subject matter is in our hands now, they're trying to figure out how are we going to get involved into actual economic development. This is the questions that we have to ask ourselves. I believe. Some of us are trying it on our own way, and at times we get blocked by the government also. I'm not sure whether because we have regional groups, or is that something that may be they are concerned that we might be coming up with a different sets of ideas and scenario. You're taking a look at the way to operate airline companies in the north. If you try to operate the airlines from the southern perspective, no airline company will make money. So from that standpoint, and we all have to look at the airline companies that are delivering the goods to us, what is it happening on the receiving end? Who's making an ends meet? Who's creating some additional opportunities? Maybe they might not have. Or they might have some difficulties because of the high cost of transportation. The fuel is high, the distance is high, it's a long way to go. So you have to take a good look at the economic side of it before you even begin to start thinking of pushing forward any kind of economic development. And you really have to do the economic feasibility study. And if you don't do that, you're entering into an area that you don't know nothing about. This is one of our biggest problems that we have over the years. Southern perspective ideas being pushed, but it's not really coming from the northern perspective. This is what we need to reconcile. But I'm not quite sure what does that really mean when it comes down to the point reconciliation. I asked the same question to Sinclair because he was an author of that concept, Justice Sinclair. I said, I have nothing to reconcile. I have nothing to give. Maybe I have a lot to receive. So maybe just put that in mind. And since I cannot really talk properly, so I'm just going to end my whatever I'm trying to do and listen to you people what you have to say because I'm here to learn also. Thank you.
Nakame.
Go, Mike.
Can we hold on to it?
I can hold on to it, Joe.
So one thing I think that you shone a light on, despite the raspy voice, is certainly that notion of land. And it's interesting because I served as on the interim board for the National Council for Reconciliation. And it was looking at what was going to be created in terms of the actual permanent National Council. And you know, you look at the 94 calls to action under Truth and Reconciliation, and nothing refers to land. And when you think about economic reconciliation, one of the biggest wealth generators in this country is land. And I think that's a critical aspect that we have to think about and to address. I'm cognizant of our time, the Inuit leadership have to leave by 8:30 because you have a very busy day. I want to open it up to questions because we have them now for 15 minutes, and we have a question in the back. Thank you.
Good morning, my name is Derek Elias. I'm with Tapiriit Inuit Association in Capers Bay. My question, I guess, each and one of you can answer if you wish. How can our Inuit leadership help our regional Inuit organizations right across Inuit Nunavut help our local economy and business development grow? As you all know, having a business, even if it's just a mom and pop shop bakery style store, doing business in the north is very expensive. And one of the main hindrances to that is air transportation costs and the cost of freight and the cost of, say, for example, just bringing flour from your local store. So how can our Inuit leadership help us regional Inuit organizations get more money to our local businesses to help them grow?
Charlie, I mean, you have the airline, right? Like, do you want to take that first?
Let me give you a try at it. I know exactly what you're talking about, and it's a fact. It's a reality. This is one of the reasons why I said earlier in my presentation that it have to be looked at from the northern perspective, not necessarily from the southern perspective. And I think the airline company, for an example, that are carrying the goods, should be looked at as an instrument that could help the community. And that is one of the reasons why that we decided ourselves in the past go into airline business, but we're still wrestling with that today on account of the fact that a lack of opportunity in terms of making a success in that area. So if the airline company, for an example, that sensitive towards the need of the community needs, rather than worrying about the airline companies have to compete, who is the one that is going to be successful in the competition area. So if you remove that and to begin to start concentrating on the area, what is needed at the receiving end. And I think the dialogue could develop between ourselves as the leaders and the regional leaders, and to start taking a good look at our economy. How can we improve our northern economy, knowing all those obstacles that we face every day? I think that is a very important, it's a dialogue that we need to establish. I think Inuit to Inuit dialogue is a very important. That is only starting to happen very recently. So before that, we were basically directed by outside how to take care of ourselves, how we run our business and things in that nature, and that according to the rules that have been set by the South. If that is continuing on, we're going to be suffering every bit of the way as we are today. So we have to start moving in the directions of taking over and start having some autonomy within ourselves to be able to state certain things and improve our airline companies, transportation, including the economic, and also be sensitive towards entrepreneurship on the receiving end, as what you're talking about. It is very hard to try to run even just a small little company in the north, catering, little restaurants and things in that nature, and that just the food transportation is high. The people that looks after the transportation side have to come closer to the community leadership to have a clear understanding and to try to develop some improvement to the life of our people on the receiving end. I hope I partially answer your questions. I know it's a very difficult area. We need to work on it.
Aluki, do you want to comment on that as well? Or?
Sure.
Or Charlie, I'll hold on.
Kuyanami or Kwana, Derek. I think in terms, and I think Charlie spoke about large business opportunities, but I think one of the things as Inuit organizations that we can do is talk about the importance of economic diversity, and to think about how do we support these smaller, I think you called it mom and pops businesses, but how do we provide, and it goes back to what I said earlier in terms of having the opportunity to make choices and being self-determined in terms of how do we want to provide for our family and being able to pursue different economic development opportunities. And I think in Nunavut we have Inuit development corporations, and I alluded to the recent announcement yesterday. And so there are Inuit business arms focused on larger business opportunities. And I think that's all very good. And I think as Inuit organizations, we often advocate for large things. For instance, in Nunavut, we're co-developing, working with the federal government on revising the Nunavut fisheries regulations, which once achieved will put us in a better position to be able to advocate strongly to expand the fisheries industry within Nunavut. And I think there's things that need to be done in terms of governance and procedures that we need to fix to help align how we can encourage and support small businesses. But I think we can also, small actions as Inuit organizations, we can take small actions as Inuit organizations. In Nunavut, we have Article 24, which speaks to government contracting, which provides preferential treatment for Inuit businesses. But when we're thinking about what kind of work do we need a consultant for a project to try and find Inuit businesses, Inuit firms that can provide that service for us. If we need catering, trying to make sure that we're supporting the local catering business owned by an Inuk. When we're providing, and many of us go to different functions where we provide gifts, always trying to bring gifts that are made by Inuit. So it's supporting these smaller business opportunities that are, and it would be a way for us to support that. And I think each of us can figure out how we can do that. Each of us can think about how is it I can further support businesses in my community or in my territory. And I think that instead of ordering umpteen cups, which we all have, those water bottles with everyone's logo on. Like, let's think about what is it that I can do. Maybe it costs a little bit more, but it will help a family, it will help a business produce something that reflects Inuit culture and is meaningful and is different, and yet a nice gift to give, not something that you just put on a shelf, right? So something like that. I think we can do that a little bit more as Inuit leadership as well.
Other questions? Nothing?
It's too early.
That's right. So, Johannes, I want to ask you a question. Because obviously, you know Nunatsiavut Group of Companies well, and your government works extensively with the private sector. You talked about the provincial government, but in your opinion, around economic reconciliation, how much does the private sector, what role do they play? Like, they play a very important part. They have to be a part of this as well. So, like, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, Clint, certainly for Nunatsiavut, we do depend on private sector to help the community sustain the services that are needed. And also, you know, the infrastructure, the needs that the private sector needs also depend on, for example, Lewisport in Newfoundland, where construction material are needed in the community to build homes that were in and the business people that depend on those certainly where the services become old and, for example, the marine shipping, and when new boats have to be purchased or be given to service Nunatsiavut. We asked for a consultation before request for proposals, but we are not given opportunity. So the private sector is again looking to us for support, and without having consulted on RFP, we now are stuck with an agreement that we'll be servicing the laboratory for the next 15 years.
Yeah.
And so the private sector is not happy. And we also all know that it's an issue that we will have to live with and wake up to every day. But hopefully something will happen that will be given to change that.
Okay, that can make. Building on what Johannes said, in your opinion as well, Natan, obviously from a national perspective, what role does the private sector play in this process?
Well, there's a lot of ways to answer that question. Historically, and even today, private sector interests in Inuit Nunangat dominate the considerations that then the federal government or public governments have in relation to natural resource extraction or other major projects. Inuit interests often lack the political capital and also then the equity within some of these major projects. And that allows for the private sector to sometimes jump over Inuit interests within the development of projects and then put Inuit in very compromised situations about supporting projects or not supporting projects, even with impact benefit agreements and with other considerations. If the private sector is looking for ways to not implement an impact benefit agreement or not implement a land claim agreement, public government interests in the past have been only too willing to help that process along. What we need more than ever is corporate citizens who also are respecting Indigenous people's rights, land claim agreements, and then also a shared vision about what we are trying to achieve. And the private sector in many cases in the past has thought very differently about the opportunity in Inuit Nunangat. The opportunity was to extract resources, profit from our people, from our subsurface, from our waters, for the enrichment of their bottom line within southern-based corporations. We see now more than ever that there are partnership agreements and that there are an emerging class of private interests, business interests that are wanting to be respectful of Inuit and also to have corporate social responsibility built into the way in which they work with us. That what we need is for the business community to demand that of all businesses within this space. It is not just for Inuit to be the policeman of the agreements that we have signed with government, the contracts that we have with all Canadians, the time and place we are now within reconciliation. Those people who believe in that as well from the business community should also champion within your community what is right and the way to do business in the 21st century with Inuit, and also to not, conversely, lobby governments to minimize the impact of Inuit land claim agreements and Inuit rights within business environments across this country. So from the very personal level, there is, I think, an obligation for those who do business in Inuit Nunangat to understand Inuit and Inuit society, so that you can be a good corporate citizen. And then from the larger picture, we are trying to change the way this all happens. And the private sector plays just as much of a role in doing that as does government, as do we.
It is 1 minute left before. Oh, sorry. May we just? Yeah. We'll get to your question too.
I just want to comment. I work with Inuit in Baker Lake artists. They were working on the wall hanging. I can handle the art. I can guide them and tell them, if you do the stitching closer together and make sure your thread is not sewing. The elders can do that, although artists can do that. But younger generation, I had to give them, if you do it this way, I don't tell them what to do. If you do it this way, it would look better. If your stitching is smaller, it would sell better. But Inuit can handle the business, but the weak part is financing and money, not enough getting money. And when I was working with the women, when you received the wall hanging, I had to send it out to Winnipeg, Vancouver, Toronto, and Montreal. That time, we didn't have internet. What I would do is call them up and find out, would you be interested in buying this wall hanging or carving or printmaking? And they say, what is it? Send me the picture. I had Polaroid camera. I had to send it. Or whenever I travel, I have 2 suitcases, very heavy, trying to sell it when I go to the meeting. I think we need to look at the if the people are going to go into economic business, they need to learn about bookkeeping. We can handle the art work. But when I was working, I didn't have enough education at that time. I never did anyway. I started late. But now younger generation, if they're interested, they learn to need from the basic stuff right up to the business part. Thank you.
Nakumek. Aluki, do you want to comment on that? Or David? Okay.
I'd like to thank the distinguished panel, and it was well worth getting up early for this. Just a short, boring introduction. My name's Robert. I work with the federal government. Don't hold it against me. I work for Global Affairs Canada, and I'm involved with Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, which is a rather dry multilateral body that is promoting trade and investment. And we talk a lot about economic inclusion. So my question is pretty straightforward, because I know often at panels such as this, there are all kinds of good ideas, and then you go away, and action isn't really taken on the ideas. So if I were to check 10 years from now, and I really wanted to know if we were making progress on economic inclusion with regards to Inuit Nunangat, either with respect to the rest of Canada, the region, or even including Inuit all across Canada, can you think of 2 metrics, 2 indicators that would tell me if we've made concrete progress on economic inclusion? And of course, your indicators will indicate what, what are the, what is most important. So that's my question.
So Aluki, you were talking about growth of GDP, and is that the only thing we should be looking at? And you're right, it's probably not going to be the only thing. But can you think of 2 indicators to see if we're making progress around economic reconciliation 10 years from now?
Well, for me, earlier I said we're all advocating to make life better for Inuit, and I think that should be the goal of economic development, is how is it impacting on our lives. And so when I said Statistics Canada put out a report in the spring saying 7 out of 10 children in Nunavut are going to bed hungry, that's really concerning. We know many Inuit are living under the poverty rate. We know the median income is vastly less for Inuit than non-Inuit. So I think those are a number of practical kind of measures I would look at, because when I think about the full implementation of the Nunavut agreement, and I'm thinking about Article 24, government contracting, I'm thinking about Article 23, Inuit representative workforce, those impact on economic development. And I think it's important that, I mean, first and foremost, that things get fully implemented. We've already agreed to them. I think that's where the frustration is. But I think also, each of us can think about how is it that this morning we're talking about expanding the circle and being more inclusive and inclusive growth. But it's so easy to continue to do the same sort of things in our mindset. And I think I would challenge people, well, what do Inuit think? And I think Charlie spoke to that. Like, we need to talk about things and ask Inuit and involve Inuit. And that's why I wanted to talk a little bit about Inuit economy and how that was a measure of our wealth and health and success, right? And just coming into this room, I noticed, Aboriginal financial institutions, like, that's great. But the first phrase there, from coast to coast, already I felt not included. What about the longest coast, where I'm from, where we're from, Inuit Nunangat? Why is it that part of the challenges that we have is always trying to say, I'm here, and Inuit. And even when we're thinking about Canada and the Indigenous, when there's discussions about Indigenous peoples, it's always First Nations, and Inuit, And I think that's much of our job, unfortunately, is educating people. And I'm glad you're with the federal government and listening to us. Thank you.
Honestly, you got 5 seconds.
Okay, I'm from a remote northern First Nation in Ontario, and earlier, Aluki, you mentioned you've been able to transition quickly from hunters and gatherers, and I can't remember your exact words, into participating in the business and economic world. I feel like we haven't really done that where we are. I'm curious what you would say has helped you transition so effectively, and maybe, as compared to maybe what you know about First Nations.
I don't think I can answer that in 5 seconds. But when you were talking, I think the first thought I had is kanokturun nang na. When in Nunavut we talk about Inuit and the different principles, kanokturun nang means talking about being resourceful. Inuit are resourceful. And I think, I'm always thinking about the people that I didn't even know that brought me to where I am today, and what responsibility I have to the people I will never know, right? In terms of, and I sometimes think about how grateful I am that people were so persistent and how people were so resilient. And so even though life challenges are facing us today, we have to muddle through it and say, okay, well, this is what I need to do to make it better for my family, my extended family. And each of us has that responsibility. By making it good for our family, our community will be better, because we'll all be taking that responsibility. And I think when I was at university, the question is always, are you trying to become a white person? Because you're leaving your home community and going out of your homeland to pursue university. And I was always questioning that, because sometimes community members would ask me that, right? And so I remember reading an autobiography by the Nobel Peace Prize winner, Rigoberta Menchú from Guatemala. And an excerpt from there really popped out at me, because she said, I'm not trying to learn Spanish to become Spanish. And she's a Quiche woman. I'm learning Spanish so it can be a tool for me to help the Quiche. And I remember reading that and thinking, I got it. And I think that's what so many Inuit, we have, because of the transition we've gone through, there's lots of trauma that we carry, but there's so many pockets where people are showing their resiliency and then being able to help And I think for those of us who are in that position, and we don't know if we'll always be in that position, life sometimes challenges us in many different ways that we don't understand. But while we're in that position, we have that responsibility, and I was going to say burden, but honor maybe, of being able to advocate strongly. And I think that's what we need to start incubating, all these pockets of success and talking about it in that way and creating the pride again and say, you know, if you understood.